Good morning. Welcome to the SBC Daily Word for Wednesday, February 23rd. We're going to be looking together at one of my favorite Psalms in all of the book of Psalms, Psalm 121. In fact, at our home, as you're walking out of our front door, which I do multiple times a day, we have this psalm in a framed plaque that was given to me by one of the dear ladies in our church. So this is a psalm that is very, very meaningful to me and my family, and also a psalm that I think we need to properly understand in its context. Psalm 121 is the second in a collection of psalms that we are calling the Songs of Ascent. And what we believe about these songs is they disciple us as pilgrims on our way back to the divine life. Most Psalms scholars believe that these 15 psalms, starting in Psalm 120 and concluding with Psalm 134, were a collection of psalms that the people of God sang, likely sequentially, as they moved from their home to Jerusalem at least 3 times a year as they made the journey to celebrate with God's people the different feasts in spring, summer, and autumn. So we're going to be, again, in Psalm 121, and I want to share this with you again, this paraphrase of a William Faulkner quote by Eugene Peterson. This is kind of the paraphrase. The Psalms of Ascent are not monuments, but footprints. A monument only says, I got this far, while the footprint says, this is where I was when I moved again. So I like us to think of each of these psalms as a footprint. In other words, kind of marking where we are in our journey and what we understand in that journey as we're moving back from east of Eden back to the divine life that we lost through our failure to trust in the goodness of God. So in Psalm 120 yesterday, we learned that oftentimes what gets us unstuck, what gets us moving back to the divine life, is we are dissatisfied with the world. Psalm 120 describes the world as characterized by lies and violence, and that was equally true in the day of the psalmist as it is today. So if you find yourself dissatisfied with the violence in our world, with the lack of truth in our world, you're in good company, because that led the psalmist to write Psalm 120, and it's the first one that gets us moving again back to the divine life. Brothers and sisters, lies and violence are the fruit of not trusting God. And when we resort to lies, when leaders resort to lies, when we resort to violence with our words or even with physical violence, the root of that fruit is a failure to trust God. So having then been dissatisfied with the lies and violence of the world of his day, he leaves that world behind, and now Psalm 121 is this psalm of trusting God, of learning again as a pilgrim what it looks like to trust God as helper, as maker, and as guard. So here's how I would break down the psalm. The first part of the psalm is verses 1 and 2. The second part of the psalm is verses 3 to 8. And the reason we divide it up that way is because of the pronouns. So I apologize for the grammar review here, but verses 1 to 2 are characterized by first person pronouns. I, my. And then verses 3 to 8 are third person. He, it. So speaking of somebody else. So here's where we kind of break this down. Verses 1 to 2 are the king's prayer. Okay? So a lot of the Psalms, to understand them in their original context before we can apply them to ourselves, we must understand that they are not about just every single individual. They are first and foremost about the king. Okay? So verses 1 and 2 are the king and his prayer. This is what the king says to God. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? Okay? Now, there's a couple of different ways you could think about this. You could think about the king in Jerusalem looking out at the mountains around Jerusalem, or you could think about the king as he begins the journey back to Jerusalem, or the people of God on their way back to Jerusalem, looking towards Jerusalem and seeing that between them and Jerusalem there is the hazard of hills, there is the hazard of mountains, there is difficulty lying in front of them. Let's start to understand why this psalm uses the idea of hills and mountains by considering what it means when the psalmist says, I lift up my eyes. We got to understand the context of this, and just look at this. Just a few psalms in front of us, and we'll look at this next week. Look at Psalm 123, just one page ahead probably, or maybe even on the same page as Psalm 121 in your text. To you, Psalm 123:1, I lift up my eyes, O you who are enthroned in the heavens. So this idea of lifting up eyes is this idea of trust. So again, he's leaving behind the world of violence and lies, and as he's being discipled by this psalm, he's learning to trust. Okay? Now, what does he lift up his eyes to? Okay? So if lifting up eyes is this idea of potentially trusting, what in Psalm 121 is he lifting his eyes toward? My text says, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Your text might say, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Now, a little bit of context here about how the Bible thinks, in the Old Testament especially, about mountains. Okay? Listen to these two verses from Ezekiel 18. The first is Ezekiel 18, verse 6. The second is verse 15. Speaking of the righteous man, okay? Ezekiel 18. If he does not eat upon the mountains or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel. Verse 6. Who does not eat upon the mountains or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel. So the mountains in kind of this ancient Near Eastern worldview, and the mountains in Scripture could be the place where the gods of the like the gods of the nations have their sanctuaries. Okay? So there's probably two different things going on here in this text. The king looks at the mountains and there's a little bit of a dread there. Okay? But then he also looks up at the mountains and there's a temptation there. There's a temptation for the king to look at the mountains where the sanctuaries of other nations' gods are found, and the temptation is to form alliances with them. Again, this comes on the heels of Psalm 120, this idea of how we've got to get unstuck from the worldly kingdoms and place our trust alone in the God of Israel, who's fully revealed by his Son, King Jesus. So the question is, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come from? Will my help come from the gods who reside in those mountains? Will my help come from forming an alliance with Egypt? Will my help come by making peace with Assyria, by making peace with Babylon? Will my help come from the gods who call those mountains home? And to that question, verse 2 gives the confession now of the king. And he gives us an unequivocal no. Verse 2, this is the confession. My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. So that's this faithful king. And keep in mind, up until King Jesus, Israel had no king who fully trusted in God, who didn't somehow try to wage treaties with other foreign kings. So that's the king's prayer. Now verses 3 to 8, the pronouns change. And then now what's happening is this king now is speaking through a minister or a priest to his people. And then this is how this king is going to look after his people. So again, the idea is they're on this journey, and then now they're going to trust in the king who's trusting in God. Okay? He will not let your foot be moved. Notice the repetition of the word not. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Now again, I think it's important for us to understand this is a king who's then placing his trust fully in God, and then now comes to the people. And notice this king doesn't say, trust in me. This king doesn't say, I have the best plan for leading the kingdom back to its glory days. No, this king faithfully points away from himself to the God in whom he trusts. Okay? So again, I think it's important for us to recognize this royal nature to this psalm. Now, the psalm is going to have implications for us, but before we can appropriately apply this psalm to our lives, we've got to understand it in its context. 2 Kings 11, 7 and 8 describes just some really pragmatic instructions about how Israel needs to do a good job of protecting their king. Okay, so speaking of this, it says, this is in 2 Kings 11, 7 and 8, and I want you to see why this is relevant. And your two divisions that come on duty in force on the Sabbath and guard the house of the Lord shall surround the king, each with weapons in hand, and whoever approaches the ranks is to be killed. Be with the king in his comings and goings. You see how that language is echoed in this idea of the king comes and goes, and who ultimately is going to guard him? Not these guards that may or may not stay awake, that may or may not faithfully do their jobs, but this king is going to faithfully lead his people because God is going to protect him. Now, ultimately, we can see it's not that far of a stretch to understand that Jesus is the faithful king described in Psalm 121. So when I say that Psalm 121 is first about the king and not about us as individual worshipers, I don't want you to then think, well, then it has nothing to do with me. No, it has everything to do with us because Jesus, as the faithful anointed king, has citizens of his kingdom. That he then says, my faithfulness to God, Jesus would say from Psalm 121, is then going to be a shade and a refuge and a shelter for you as you journey on Jesus, the road, the way back to divine life. So, just a couple of principles perhaps to apply in our thinking about Psalm 121. First, Psalm 121 takes deism out to the woodshed. Deism. A lot of the founding fathers of the United States were deist. A deist believes in God, but a deist believes in a distant God. A deist believes that God created everything and then set the world into motion, and then now he has nothing to do with the world or humans or anything. Psalm 121, especially read in this interpretive Christological framework, says that God, through King Jesus, is very attuned to his promises to Jesus, and Jesus then bringing his people safely back to divine life. Psalm 121 describes a God who is not far away, but who is very involved through his anointed king in keeping his promises to his people. Secondly, Psalm 121 promises God's anointed king will faithfully lead his people home. Psalm 121 faithfully promises that God's faithful king will lead his people home. This is important because Psalm 121 has been used by prosperity gospel preachers to say, if you're faithfully walking with God, you should never have your foot slip. You should never have your foot stumble. Ultimately, Psalm 121 is not promising you and I that we will never have any trip ups, that we will never have any difficulties on our journey back home. Instead, what Psalm 121 is promising us is when we trust in the God who sets apart a king to gather together his people, he will ultimately faithfully lead his people home. This became very relevant for me. This more accurate reading of Psalm 121 as a pastor who, when COVID allows, likes to do hospital visits. And I remember one time being out doing something else and then getting a phone call that a church member had stumbled and fallen and was in the hospital and needed a visit. So I was out, wasn't kind of doing the pastoral thing. I forget what even we were doing. I think it may have been in the summertime, and it was shortly after like a baseball game or a baseball practice. So I immediately left that game or that practice and headed to the hospital, and I didn't have my Bible with me. And one of the things that I'd like to do when I visit somebody in the hospital, especially during a painful, difficult time, is before I pray to read a psalm. Well, without a Bible, I just decided to, okay, what psalm do I have committed to memory? Psalm 121 was the psalm that I had committed to memory. And I began to, as I'm praying in the emergency room with somebody who has tripped and fallen in a parking lot, Psalm 121 that says things like, he will not let your foot be moved. That's the idea of stumbling. And I'm beginning to pray this, and this is kind of the way my mind works, to where I said the first couple of verses, and then I could see in the future this verse coming, and I think I kind of went to Psalm 46 instead or something. And spent some time then after that visit was over thinking, what does Psalm 121 really mean? And then that experience caused me to then revisit it again and understand that Psalm 121 is not promising that you're never going to trip, that you're never going to slip on the ice, that you're never going to have difficult experiences. What Psalm 121 is promising us is that you and I have a faithful king. And while we stumble and move back towards that divine life, he will faithfully get us home. So may our trust for help be rooted not in Capitol Hill, not in Mount Rushmore, but in the God who comes to us from and who comes to Mount Zion. May grace and peace and everything good be yours.